Much of this singular focus on Andersonville surrounded the controversial post-war trial and execution of Captain Henry Wirtz, the man in charge of the day-to-day operations of Andersonville Prison. Wirtz was hung in November 1865 for committing war crimes against Union prisoners held at Andersonville. The fact that Wirtz was identified by Northerners as a demonic monster, while no apology was made for the suffering of Confederate POWs in the North, did not sit well with white Southerners. This Southern frustration with the North's preoccupation with Wirtz, combined with the Northern insistence on defining Andersonville as a place of heroism in the face of Southern evil, while ignoring the failings of Union prison camps, outraged generations of white Southerners. As more and more monuments popped up each year around the National Cemetery and old prison grounds at Andersonville, and year after year Northerners traveled to Andersonville to celebrate Memorial Day, many Southerners fumed at the one-sided, self-congratulatory nature of Northern memory. By 1909, some white Southerners, led by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, decided that the rhetorical war over the proper remembrance of history demanded a monument in honor of Henry Wirtz. So they built one. Across the highway, in the town of Andersonville, you will find the Wirtz Monument in the town square. As Confederate veteran J.R. Gibbons explained in justifying the building of a monument to a man executed as a war criminal, it is a little peculiar that the people of the North can put up their fine monuments in the South, right under our noses, falsifying history, and think it is all right, but the Southern people must say nothing. White Southerners like Gibbons wanted the freedom to remember the Civil War on their terms. And that freedom, even if linked to a failed cause, still resonated in Southern memories. Just as armies claimed territory in war, so too in peace did these monuments mark the historical claims made by North and South in the ongoing competition to define the legacy of the Civil War. Even in the early 1900s, the energy devoted to building monuments by white Northerners and Southerners showed the urgent relevance Andersonville still had in American culture. So why did the Civil War in Andersonville still loom so large in the minds of many Americans several decades after the end of the war? What further complicated the story of remembering Civil War prisons in Andersonville was that there was a third strand of memory involved as well, the African American or emancipationist memory of the conflict. For many African Americans, Andersonville didn't represent the story of saving the Union, or the story of how white Southerners did the best they could for their captives in a collapsing Confederacy. Instead, Andersonville was a symbol of freedom and the end of slavery. Think about that for a moment. Andersonville as a prison existed because the Confederacy wanted to deny freedom to its African American slaves. And so even though relatively few African American soldiers ever made it to Andersonville as captives, when the war ended, Andersonville became sacred ground for African Americans who wanted to remember the Civil War as a triumphant moment of emancipation. During Reconstruction, a school for black children was opened at the former prison site here. A place of death and suffering was transformed into a place of hope for the future. And Memorial Day for local African Americans became known instead as Andersonville Day. Throughout the late 1800s, most of the thousands of people that came to Andersonville each May were black, not white. Yet by the early 1900s, the northern monuments dominated the former prison site. The Wirtz Monument stood tall in the village of Andersonville, and the local newspaper reported that only small crowds of African Americans now attended the Memorial Day ceremonies. So what happened? One of the tragic consequences of the battle to remember Andersonville was that the struggle over Civil War memory was racially motivated. While Northern and Southern whites might disagree over what Andersonville represented, by the late 1800s, a rising tide of racism across the United States, the start of the Jim Crow era, encouraged whites, regardless of section, to remember the Civil War as a war fought over politics. This conception of the war in white American memory meant that the conflict became either a Northern war to save the Union or a Southern crusade fought for the lost cause of states' rights. The central cause of race and slavery that motivated and dominated the war was first abandoned politically at the end of Reconstruction and was then abandoned in memory by the early 1900s. Again, this was not coincidence. Until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, America, North and South, was a nation characterized in part by white supremacy. And part of that racist mindset was the result of choosing to remember the Civil War, as at Andersonville, without acknowledging the memories of the central role that race and slavery played in the conflict. Civil War memory in this case encouraged, indeed some would say encourages, the persistence of American racism. Now, I know some of you are thinking that racism no longer defines this country the way it once did. And certainly tremendous progress has been made in the last 50 years in America on that front. But even though the generation that fought the Civil War and the generation that built the monuments to define the conflict are long dead, the Civil War in Andersonville remain, in terms of memory, an evolving story. One that I believe has relevance for all of us today. Many historians call the Civil War the first modern war. And the brutality of the event, especially its prisons, certainly shocked Americans who lived through the trauma of the 1860s. Sadly, we have become even more hardened by the scale of modern war, from World War I and II, through the Cold War conflicts, and in today's global efforts to combat terrorism and promote the spread of democracy. As Americans, we have lived almost constantly at war or in the shadow of war over the last 100 years. And this has changed our perspective on what atrocity and human suffering means. 13,000 dead POWs at Andersonville was and always will be significant. But when viewed in the context of the even deadlier wars of the 20th century, the old arguments made by North and South that these deaths were caused by intentional evil or conspiracy seem outdated. As many of you veterans know far better than I, war always results in suffering, especially for POWs. According to our more modern and informed understanding of war, it's simply an unfortunate cost of the process of combat and the protection of our national security. And as our perception of war has changed, over the last several decades, Andersonville has again been transformed to match our contemporary memory needs. In 1970, partly in response to the Vietnam War, Andersonville National Cemetery and the old prison site were reorganized under the National Park Service to form Andersonville National Historic Site. In 1998, thanks in large part to the support of former POWs from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, the National Prisoner of War Museum opened its doors here as well. Newer monuments honoring POWs from more recent conflicts now also mark the ground here. In a very real sense, today Andersonville has been redefined as a shrine to our contemporary prisoners of war. A new memory, emphasizing patriotic sacrifice, has been grafted onto the older Civil War story. There is a panel in the lobby of the POW Museum that honors the men and women of this country who suffered captivity so that others could remain free. Their story is one of sacrifice and courage, their legacy, the gift of liberty. This is a powerful and compelling use of memory. And in many ways, it indicates that as a nation, we have mostly healed from the wounds of the 1860s. Andersonville is becoming a symbol of American unity instead of Civil War controversy. Freedom and liberty today are words that we all love. In fact, many here today have bled and sacrificed for these ideals. But it is also appropriate to recognize the dangers inherent in our patriotism, especially on Memorial Day, because our preference for positive memories often creates unintended damage. Just as memories of Andersonville were once used as weapons to silence the full understanding of the emancipationist legacy of the Civil War, today our understanding of captivity in modern wars as an endless, unavoidable cycle of suffering inadvertently blinds us to the urgent need to treat all POWs with respect, regardless of background. Ultimately, we celebrate Memorial Day because we all recognize that the Civil War was then, and still remains, a story of freedom. But what our competing memories over the years show us is that freedom can mean many different things to many different people. On the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, perhaps we can finally recognize that before Andersonville has anything to teach us, we must first be completely honest with ourselves about why we try so hard to remember what happened here. It is in that honest search to come to terms with the past that we best honor the sacrifices made here at Andersonville during the Civil War and by all of our veterans throughout the years. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Dr. Cloyd, for that thought-provoking presentation. As a small measure of our gratitude, and to help you remember this day, I have a couple gifts for you. First, please accept this commemorative coin depicting Andersonville's Civil War prison on one side, and on the other, the logo of the National Prisoner of War Museum. I am also presenting to you a new publication from the National Park Service called The Civil War Remembered. It contains a number of essays from leading historians that I believe you will appreciate. Thank you again for being our featured speaker today.